In this chapter, I'd like to show you the workflow process that I go through for creating a rendering and compiling it in Photoshop. Let's have a look at the bookshelf scene, and this is a really good scene to use as a rendering. Before we export it into the various styles that we want to then import into Photoshop, let's add some final touches. First, I always like to add a person in the model. So let's add this SketchUp file called Seated Man. And this is a face me component, meaning wherever you orbit, the component always faces you. And it's a setting that you save when you create components. It's great for people, and it's also good for trees. Now, the other setting that I like to adjust is to turn this into a 2-point perspective. Right now, it's very subtle, but you could see the vertical edges teeter. They're not true vertical lines. To fix this, just go to Camera and select 2-point perspective. Let's take the Select tool, sample that wood. Let's fix that last step that we forgot to color in there. And we can also hide the edges here. Apply the wall texture. Hide this top edge. And hide that bottom edge. And that way that looks flush. Remember, of course, in this video, let's go ahead and export the various display styles that we want to show in our final rendering. Now, the first one that I always do is this shaded with texture. However, I don't want the lines to be completely black. I actually want to turn them off. So go to View, Edge Style, and turn off the edges. Go to File, Export, select 2D Graphic. Set your file type as JPEG. Usually how I'll name these is I'll name them the name of the rendering. In this case, we'll just call this rendering. And then I'll put a hyphen. And for this one, I just called this texture. Go to Options and just make sure you have the image settings that you want there. And then click Export. The next one that we can do is just the edges. And that's in case the back edges don't display well. Go to File, Export, select 2D Graphic. The last one that I usually like to do is using the styles. And depending on the rendering technique that you're doing, this could add some visual character and interest to your model. There's this one here that I really like within the Style Builder competition winners, and it's a stroke that has a lot of these watermarks on it. I'm just going to edit it so that we can turn off the watermark. I also want to turn off the section cut and section planes. That looks pretty cool. In this video, I'm going to show you how you can stack images in Photoshop. Typically, I would select all my images and then drag them into Photoshop. And when you'd open Photoshop, they'd come in as 4 separate files. And this is great. It opens up the files, but then you have to spend time to select all, copy it, and then paste it into the next file so that they're all into one file. Instead of doing that, to load these files into one stack, you can go to File, Scripts, and then there's an option called Load Files into Stack. It brings up this screen where you can either browse for the files, or if you already have them open, you can just click Add Open Files, and then click OK. It'll do some funny things on your screen for a couple seconds, but then if you go into your Layers palette, you'll see that on this untitled file, To modify and adjust the layers so that they're all into one image, we need to adjust and play around with the settings for the opacity as well as for the blend. Now for the top 3 layers, which are all essentially white and just have the line work, for the blending properties, we want to set this to multiply. That will essentially remove all of the white and blend those elements together into this image. The edges and the back edges are still pretty harsh. It's a very strong line. So we can take the opacity and just drop that down and do it with the watermark as well. The last thing that we want to do before we save our rendering is adjust in the watermark layer. We can use the eraser and just notice some points, especially in transparent textures, where the edges are above the line work there. So we can erase those edges there and here where a person is sitting. You can do the same thing with the back edges. If you want to make these changes to be non-destructive, you of course can use a layer mask. You can also check out the titles at Infinite Skills in Photoshop as well to learn some other techniques. This looks pretty good. We can now go to File, Save As. Let's save this as rendering. And we'll also do a Save As a JPEG. Now, this type of rendering and process is still relatively flat for a rendering, so it doesn't have the ambient occlusions or lighting that photorealistic renderings have. So in the next chapter, I'm going to show you one photorealistic rendering plugin for SketchUp called SU Podium, where you can create photorealistic renderings.